Well, yesterday on the show, we brought you the story of Serena Woods of Fredericton. She was taken to the New Brunswick Women's Correctional Center in Miramichi for failing to pay two $100 fines. One was for breaching a court order. The other was an unpaid victim surcharge. She didn't have the money to pay, so Fredericton police put her in a holding cell overnight. She was then transferred by sheriffs to the jail in Miramichi, but when she got there, she was told her fine was deemed paid because of time she had already spent in custody. And when she was released, she had less than $20 in her purse.
You're just going to let me out into someplace I don't even know, to a woman out, and tell me to hitchhike. Give me a Google map and leave me to my own devices.
They gave you a Google map?
They gave me a Google map to tell me on which way to go, which way to hitchhike. They told me they couldn't keep me because it wasn't a hotel. And I would have gladly stayed the one extra night just to get a ride home, shackled and everything, but no. They basically told me it wasn't a hotel and I needed to go home. Then they gave me a ride to the gas station and that was it.
Serena Woods was released in Miramichi without a way back to her home in Fredericton. Now, she eventually did make it back thanks to the help of a few kindly truckers. Charles Murray heard Woods' story on CBC for the first time yesterday, and he's still trying to comprehend how it could have happened and why the provincial correction system would treat anyone that way. He is New Brunswick's Ombudsman, and he is in the studio with me this morning. Good morning, Mr. Murray. Thanks for coming in.
Good morning.
When you heard that story on the show yesterday, what did you think?
I hope I thought the same thing any New Brunswicker would think when they heard that story, which was a sense of deep unease and a feeling that, oh dear, surely as a province, this is not what we're about. Surely we can do better than we did in this case.
Okay, so what was the issue that you saw in that story?
Well, there's multiple places at which I think we could have done much, much better. But I think at the heart of it all was there was a failure as human beings to recognize the vulnerability of this woman caused by her poverty. So she was basically placed in a situation of potential risk, and our duty to protect her and care for her and to just treat her with respect as a human being, we just didn't discharge it. Everyone did their jobs, but nobody saw her need for us to take that extra step. Well, I say nobody. The truck drivers saw that. And the truck drivers did the thing that I think we would want New Brunswickers to do. The truck drivers did the thing that I think reflects our values as a society. So the disturbing question is, how is it that the private company and the supervisor that approved that were able to find the way to do the thing that we as New Brunswickers would want, but that our government, the department that we hire to reflect our values, missed it so badly? And that, to me, is the really disturbing question. And that's where I think we have to have some really hard reflection on how we can do better.
Okay, so how should that situation have been handled?
Well, there's a number of places where I think we could have done better. If she was going to be released in Miramichi, it strikes me that a phone call from Fredericton that would have ascertained that could have saved everyone a lot of trouble. And that entire trip would have been unnecessary. If at the point she was being released in Miramichi, she was signaling her distress that she didn't find a way home, and people felt that they couldn't do more for her, there were phone calls that could have been made to put her in touch with agencies that would have stepped up to help her. But those calls weren't made. And instead, a printout of a Google map, there's a certain callousness to a way in which we respond to this. It just doesn't reflect her actual situation. If you and I were dropped off there, we'd be inconvenienced, but we'd make some calls. We'd have friends who would come and get us. But this woman, because of her poverty, didn't have those options, and we just completely failed to recognize that, despite her signaling that to us. And that's the real failure.
So who had the responsibility for determining whether or not she had the resources to make her way back to Fredericton from Miramichi? Was that the people at the correctional facility? Was that the sheriffs who brought her to Miramichi? Who had that responsibility?
Well, you take your pick, because I think this story is largely about a number of people who did their jobs and did only their jobs. But at some point, with her expressing this, someone needed to take off their hat as employee and put on their hat as human being or New Brunswicker and say, okay, notwithstanding that this isn't part of my job, what am I going to do to make sure that this person is safe? The truck drivers weren't doing their jobs, but they were doing the thing that we would expect people to do. And if we have a culture inside government and inside departments in which we say to people, well, just do your jobs and do only your jobs, this is the price we pay. We want to have a culture where we say to our employees, look, do the right thing, and your supervisor will back you, the department will back you. And that's what we needed to empower those people to do that. And I don't think that would have resulted in a large burden. I think there's a number of phone calls they could have made to a number of agencies where people would have stepped up and said, okay, we'll meet her here. There's an emergency line in the Department of Social Development. There's an Elizabeth Fry Society. There are a number of charities in the community, all of whom will step up because volunteers in those places or employees in those places say, I see my obligation here to make sure that vulnerable people are protected. But the people we pay, in this case, didn't make those calls.
Who in government has the responsibility to make changes to ensure that this kind of thing doesn't happen again?
Well, the first line response from the department, which is exactly what you'd expect, would be to say policy was followed. So now the question needs to be posed by those who provide political direction. Are you comfortable with what we did in this case? Is the minister responsible for this department? Does he think, yeah, we did the right thing here. This is what I'm comfortable with. Is the premier of the province comfortable to say, yeah, this is how we should treat people in this situation? Are the people in the Legislative Assembly who represent us, do they say, yeah, our conduct here reflects our value as New Brunswickers? If the answer to that is no, and I think it should be, and if I know those people it is, then it's on them now to provide direction to the department and to the employees to ensure that in cases like this, the extra step is taken, and that when it's taken, the employees who take that will not be in trouble for having taken the extra step.
Okay, but here's some insight into how government sees this. We had a Justice Department spokesperson talk to us, and they said the province is under no obligation to make sure a person in custody gets home. Is that a reasonable position for government to take?
That is a very standard first line response which cites a broad policy. But you say to yourself, how did that policy work in the real world in this case? So some people are immediately taking the sort of absurd suggestion that, well, maybe what people are asking for is that we have a taxi service that takes everybody home. Nobody is suggesting that as a government program. What they're saying is when you find someone in an exceptional case, we drop that woman off at a bus station / gas station with no bus coming and not enough fare to take the bus. And we said to her, well, you're going to have to find your own way home. She had no realistic prospect of getting home, and we didn't put her in touch with people who could help her. Now, we don't need to change government policy to hand deliver every discharged inmate exactly to their home, to say, in a case like this, we find a person who's vulnerable because of their poverty, we're going to take the extra step to make sure that that person is kept safe.
Okay, and I'm pleased that you're framing this as a condition or a symptom of how people who are in an impoverished situation find themselves trying to cope with certain situations. But I'm just wondering how much public sympathy there would be for that. Here's a comment online from Jeff Cronkite, and he writes, "Might I remind you all that she had 2 outstanding amounts from 2 separate crimes. This could have easily been prevented had she A, not committed the crimes in the first place, B, fulfilled her promise to the court to pay said amounts. I can't believe that people are siding with her on this. She broke the law, and she didn't fulfill her obligation to the court, but she is the victim here. Certainly she was inconvenienced, but how inconvenienced were the people she committed crimes against?" Now, is that a relevant perspective?
So there's lots in that I could take issue with, but I'll focus on a couple of things. One is the notion that, well, she did a crime and therefore she has to pay a punishment. She did her night in jail. She paid her punishment. The question is a legitimate part of her punishment that she also be dropped off hours from home with no realistic way of getting home? What are we punishing her for at that point? I think at that point, the thing we're really punishing her for is being poor and not for committing a crime. And the other thing is to say, well, in this particular case, is this reasonable that we're seeing her as a victim because she's been inconvenienced? That for you and I would have been inconvenience. We put her health and safety at risk. Is that reasonable? Is it reasonable for us as a society to say, well, if you commit crimes, one of the things we're going to do as a society is we're going to place you in situations which are dangerous, where you're going to have to hope that you make smart choices or are lucky so that you get home safely. Is that a humane, does that reflect our values as New Brunswickers? Nobody's suggesting, oh, criminals should get off scot-free, but it's a far step from that to say, well, one of the things we're going to do for criminals is we're going to drop them off in far-flung locations with a Google map and wish them good luck in getting home. That is not a humane response. And you don't have to say, I'm going to be soft on crime, to say, I think we can do better than that.
From Serena Woods' perspective, do you think this is over now? This is done, or does she have other options here?
I don't know about her particular case, but I'll say something about this. We have people who deal with their offices all the time, and they have an interaction with government in which they feel they weren't respected as a person, in which their humanity wasn't recognized, in which they didn't feel heard or they didn't feel protected or any of those things. That doesn't go away. Long after the specific incident is gone, that sense of violation of personhood, that sense of insecurity, that sense of the society is not on my side, will not protect me, the people who are in my government aren't on my side, that stays with them. And that is often the thing that lingers long after the actual impact of the incident is there. That's why this part of the relationship between citizens and governments is so important, because the damage it does lingers long after the originating incident.
What does it say? What does it say that we were prepared to put this woman in a correctional facility because she wasn't able to pay these, or chose not to? I'm not sure what the situation is. That she didn't pay these $200 fines.
Well, there's a whole issue there which I could go on a long talk about, but the reality is that a victim fine surcharge is a federally imposed action for which the judge has no discretion. And in a case where someone pays a large fine, and the VFS doesn't create a barrier, but in a case where you have a person who doesn't have means, and they're given a fine, they say, well, you're going to be fined $500 for 5 days, and there's a victim fine surcharge of an additional $50 or something like that. When that person with their means says, I'll take the 5 days, the judge knows full well that person's never going to pay that $50. That's just not going to happen. So what we're doing, again, because of that person's poverty, we're setting them up for failure. We're setting them up to be recharged on the breach, and we're setting the system up for the expense of arresting, processing, holding that person. Apparently, in this case, driving them all the way up to the mirror machine. All because the real problem here, the real crime they've committed in that case, is they just don't have financial means. Now, there are other things we could do, but in the case of the victim fine surcharge, you can't work that fine off in the community. You basically have to find that money somewhere. And realistically, was that ever going to be, I mean, if we were to do a track of all the victim fine surcharges of people who were on assistance or were at the margins of society, what would be the rate of pay and what's the effect? I think we have to ask ourselves if that policy is really accomplishing anything for the victims, or if it's just creating a whole new group of victims and taking a lot of time with the people who enforce our laws simply to punish people for their poverty. And I'm not sure what lesson the people who are getting processed for not paying fines are supposed to learn. Are we basically prepared to tell them, look, the system is going to continue to process you and you're going to spend night and night in jail until you get the message, stop being poor. You know, is that what we're trying to do as a society? I think we have to be a little more rational about this and say, look, if it's not realistic for this person to discharge this money, let's find some other solution.
And I suppose, in a worst case scenario, if they had dropped Serena Woods off the gas station and she had decided to hitchhike and ended up, succumbing to cold weather or a storm, then this would be an even bigger issue than it is now.
In a worst case scenario, which I don't like to think about, and we're in a worst case scenario, a person without the same network who would pick her up, who makes an unlucky decision, and the person driving them gets talking to them, and they say, nobody knows you're here, you don't have a cell phone, and that person vanishes and shows up in some inquiry years from now as part of a group of people that nobody knows what happened to them. The weeks and weeks went by before anyone noticed they were missing.
So should we stop incarcerating people for not paying their victim surcharge fines?
I think we should step back and ask ourselves to what degree we're putting ourselves as a society through unnecessary expense and diverting police resources for punishing people for the crime of being poor. I think we have to just step back and say, all this thing that we're doing with these fines and this victim fine surcharge, is this actually accomplishing the goal we want, or are we just having a side effect of creating a new set of victims while saying to ourselves with a laudable goal, well, we've created a victim fund. There's nothing wrong with that goal, but whenever we have a policy which we apply, doesn't matter what your circumstances are, we always do this, we risk injustice. And that's what happened in this case. We always drop inmates off at the bus station. That's what we do. But if you don't look at the individual circumstances of the person, that's where you risk real injustice.
Thank you for your time.
Thanks for your interest.
Charles Murray is Ombud for the province of New Brunswick. Any thoughts on what you heard, please get in touch. Some comments on Twitter. Jeff Thompson writes, hi at SegCBC. Your interview with the Ombudsman was refreshing. A public official who can see common sense through public policy. He's right. We can go above and beyond in some cases like this. I am thinking of Minister Harris's comments earlier this week. We can do more there too. And then Christian Gabriel writes, this man is very good at his job. Mavis Doucette says, if she had died by the side of the road on a cold winter night, would we then consider that her crime had been paid? Jeff Kimball writes, couldn't agree more. It's been a very good interview. Anyone who has ever done anything at Service New Brunswick knows what the not my job attitude feels like. It's time now for your...
And Charles Murray, very smart guy.